Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Ifaka and Patrick for inviting me. It's a huge honor and privilege to be with you here, and thank you for adopting me as a brother of Africa for a couple of days, and I hope that time will be extended for years to come. So, I'd like to share a little bit of my experience coming from one of the smallest nations in the world. I know we have smaller nations in the room today, but one of the most densely populated also nations in the world, and that's Malta. On how we, as a small country, a European country, developed the creative economy. So I'd like to kick off with a bit of geography. That is what my island looks like from the planet from a satellite. And I also love the fact that, you can actually see the airport from the satellite image if you look very closely, just to give you an understanding of the dimension. And also love the fact that when you fly over the region, and there are people visiting Malta for the first time, and they're flying over and the pilot says, "We're landing," people go like, "Oh, look, that's Malta." And I'm like, "No, that's actually Sicily. That's another country." And they go like, "Oh, okay, we'll have a second take then. Oh, look, that's Malta." But essentially, my first point to raise here, and maybe this is the reason why I'm here, is that you don't need to be a massively sophisticated, out-of-this-world, 22nd century type of country to actually develop the creative economy. Every single region, every single country has the potential. Why? Because culture is owned by everyone. So it's up to that individual region, country, city to make sense of that. So let's zoom out a little bit, and I needed to make a little bit of an effort there to put a circle around where my country is. And as you can see, it's geographically positioned, sandwiched at the center of the Mediterranean. So you get this, from a cultural point of view, a very interesting mix of North Africa. From a linguistic point of view, people think that we're Arab, we're Italian, we're French, we're a little bit of everything. But this is the baggage that you bring to the table when you start to think about the creative economy. Because as much as we are talking about the future, we are not here to deny our past. Now, we mentioned this a couple of times here about the heritage, the cultural heritage. So a country with 4,000, 5,000 years of history, with the oldest freestanding structures in the world, of course, cultural heritage is important. It's a huge responsibility. There's one of the highest concentrations of World Heritage Sites in a country, which means that you are not only responsible for that on behalf of your own people, but on behalf of the world. So when you're talking about the future, about contemporary practice, that starts making things a little bit complicated. Because what do you prioritize? How do you value all this? So I, myself, as a theater maker and a theater director, understand the importance of that, of World Heritage Sites, but I also need to make sure that I am also, as an artist, in the now, looking at the future. So I like to look at video games produced by Maltese artists, contemporary art, contemporary dance. And this is the kind of dialogue which we wanted to start. So 10 years ago, I was called at the office, at the Ministry of Finance. From back then, I used to work at the National Arts Center, and I was told by this person, you're a bit of a troublemaker in the arts, aren't you? I said, well, I don't know what kind of perception I have. He said, and because I've been writing about that, Malta needs to invest in culture, and he said, okay, tell me what we should do. So fast forward 6 months later, I noticed that I had proposed the idea of a first National Arts Fund. Fast forward 2 years, he called me back, and I went in my shorts and T-shirt, not knowing, again, because we had no AC working back at the Art Center, and he said, "I'd like you to come to the Finance Ministry to work here." I was like, "What?" He said, "Because I would like to start looking at this thing called the creative economy." I said, "But I'm not an economist, I'm a cultural policy maker, I'm a theater maker, and I'm an advocate for the arts." He said, "That's exactly why I would like you and other people to join." So I found myself at the office of the Permanent Secretary within the Ministry of Finance, working with economists to shape a creative economy strategy, which I think so far is one of a very, and so there's another take-home idea. Most of the work in creative economy will not start from the culture ministry. Why? Because frankly speaking, I think we have way too many hang-ups to understand the complexity of the creative economy. We like to talk about art, which is great, and most of the times we just hang around that space. We don't look beyond that. So this is my first challenge. Whenever I am anywhere in the world, I ask people, make sure that the finance people are there, not for the money. That's not where the conversation starts. Look beyond that. So what happened then was we had two important principles which we were dealing with. First of all, why was the Ministry of Finance and Economy interested in this? Because we had new investments being looked at in Malta. We had Malta's international attractiveness. If you're developing a sector, if you are asking businesses from across the world to come to Malta to base themselves, people move to countries not because there's just work, but because they want to live there. And that means when they live there, it means they need to want to hang around good places, cool places. And they're just not going to hang around great hotels and restaurants for their life, for 5 years, for 10 years. They want to be part and parcel of the creative community. And the arts and culture are part and parcel of that. It also adds value to discerning companies. So it's not just about competitiveness and attractiveness, but it also makes the country a livable environment. And I found this very interesting and fascinating because the finance ministry and the economy was also interested in well-being. And I think that's something we need to look at because the economy is not just about money. A creative economy actually has nothing to do with just money. It's about how we live. Economy now is about the well-being. It's about the environment. It's about the resources, our natural and other resources. But at the same time, so this is from the creative economy strategy, where we said, who are the assets? Who is at the heart of this sector? Creative workers and cultural assets. So the human side, but also the infrastructure. So we had to, of course, understand how do you actually give value to these beautiful, amazing historical buildings and sites which you have. But through talent, skill, entrepreneurship, and intellectual property, and I'm going to keep on repeating on this, the creative worker can generate new jobs and companies and help mature industries to retool the future. So we're also looking at how do we support existing industries rethink, because that is what creative practice allows you to do. So we looked at that economic principle. But at the same time, which was also very interesting, we were drafting the first national cultural policy. So we found that this was a unique opportunity to position ourselves whereby economic principles and cultural principles can actually be in conversation. And of course, the easiest part was that I was actually a co-author of both documents. So it was kind of quite easy to plug in the creative economy in one and the cultural policy in other. But it wasn't just about plugging in ideas. It was actually understanding and coming to terms that they're not fighting with each other. Cultural policy does not fight economic development and vice versa. To me, nowadays, they are part and parcel of the same conversation. Fine, we're looking at it from a different angle. But whereas economists talk about market failure, we talk about grants, to address market failure. It's not just about a subsidy. So the cultural policy principles also looked at, fine, beyond the economic development. We're also talking about giving people the right to participate in culture and to actively participate as part of their human identity and dignity, with benefits accruing for the well-being and quality of life of society at large. So this is the parameter we were working in. And what we wanted to do was, first of all, understand what is the value, the economic value of all this. So that's the process we kicked off 10 years ago. So we looked at defining the sector, and this is a very complex thing to do. No matter how many definitions you bring, you need to define your own, because you're also dealing with the specificities of your own territory. Mapping, we reviewed the sector, we searched for solutions, and we developed a strategy, which I'm going to briefly talk about. At the same time, we had an ongoing consultation process. We had a coordinated approach between different ministries. We had to conduct loads of research for a research base which practically did not exist, and also communicate those results. So the first thing we had to look at is, what do we understand by the creative economy? And we looked at the UNCTAD model. At the same time, we had the European Union coming up with the results of the economic impact of European creative industries. And we looked at the UK model. And actually, I said, okay, we need to create a fusion of all this to actually make it our own. Why? Because there were specific components, such as traditional festivals and festivities, which were quite unique, which were not found in other creative economy models, but actually mattered a lot to us. And frankly speaking, I knew that they mattered quite a lot to the politicians. So if I actually removed them from our definition, it wouldn't have helped the actual advocacy of the creative economy, looking at it from its totality. Now, that doesn't mean that that does not create a problem, because we had people from the craft sector saying, but we're not from the game sector. We're not the same. We have people from the music industry saying, but we're not in the film sector. Or the indigenous film sector is saying, but the film servicing people are the ones making money. So we had to explain that actually we're looking at the collective component on how this actually makes sense. So we had these kind of 4 pillars which we've created: the heritage, arts, media, and creative business services. But what we were really interested was in the fact of, how do these different subsectors actually relate? How does crafts connect to design? How does architecture connect to traditional festivities or cultural sites? How does the advertising sector actually work with the visual arts? And in another research exercise we did, we realized that people may be amateur actors, they do it for fun, but they're actually employed full-time in the advertising industry. So they are creative workers. They may have never seen that in their life. So at the same time, we're not looking at just professionalizing each and every sector, but it's actually, how do you maximize and understand the narrative and the connections that happen between these different subsectors? Because that is where innovation actually happens. So just to give you a little bit of a quick framework of what we did, the first important thing was to make sure that there is an actual political commitment. So whether we like it or not, policies do matter. Having something on a piece of paper does matter. Of course, if you shelve it and leave it there, then it just remains a piece of paper. So at the time, we had the cultural policy being published. We also plugged this in at the time, the euro was going through huge difficulty and recession. There was a Euro Plus Pact going on across the Euro member states, European member states, and the creative economy commitment in Malta was one of the deliverables which Malta gave to the European Commission. So every quarter we had to report back not only to the Maltese public, but also to the European Commission in Brussels, what Malta is doing in the creative economy. So that was really important. But then what happened was we created a working group, which was a collaborative program between cultural experts, economists from the Economic Policy Division, and the research team at the National Statistics Office. And of course, these 2 important institutions lying within the Finance Ministry, it made it very easy, because I did not need to lobby for that. It was part and parcel of the organization I was working for. So suddenly within the National Statistics Office, we had a cultural statistician giving us access to all the data that was previously untapped. And that made it very, I would say easy, but that is where we kind of managed to lay out the first conversation on what the creative economy actually meant. Because as we mentioned yesterday and today, numbers are important, whether we like it or not. Whether we understand them, then that's another thing. Or how we interpret them, that's another conversation. So what happened after that? We also had the Management Efficiency Unit to actually start mapping out how the public sector actually organizes itself. Because if you have a new sector that is emerging, it is highly unlikely for the sector to be organized in a good way in the public sector. So what happened then was we had the management efficiency unit look at the different governance models to actually say, how are the different subsectors knowing, when we map the sector, that the cultural and creative industries, which we now call the cultural and creative sectors because we also have a problem in Europe calling them industries, but that's for another conversation. What happened then was that we had around 6 different ministries and around 25 different organizations with a finger in the creative economy pie. So you say, if you're trying to create one cohesive sector across 6 to 9 different ministries, how can you have a shared vision for this? And that creates a lot of problems as you go along in implementing any strategy. So the other part we did was we created 4 expert groups. We brought in sector-specific experts to have a very frank conversation in the process. So as we were drafting and conducting research, we were all the time referring back to the different working groups we had, and also one consultative body that brought all the key players from different ministries together around the same table. Now, most of this happened to be, it was like a rubber stamping exercise, because they wouldn't bring ideas but that was important in terms of providing feedback and also providing a platform for people to say, you can participate in this and that you are part and parcel of this process. What we then developed, we looked at immediate actions. We said we can't wait for 3 years to launch a strategy and expect that there's buy-in of the sector and the whole community. So we implemented some things, and of course, when you're at the finance ministry drafting budgets, that's kind of very easy because the budget office is just around the corner. So for every year, we made sure that we had new budgetary measures being rolled out. So we didn't wait for 3 years. We started rolling out new funding programs, tax incentives. So we had 7 new funding programs and 6 fiscal incentives to start also plugging in a narrative for the creative economy. We then launched a strategy, which I will briefly mention what the key priorities were. We had 4 strategic parts and 45 actions for the culture and creative sectors. We then, of course, like any other process, we went through a public consultation process. And then, fast forward a couple of years, both political parties plugged in the creative economy in their manifesto. So it was like a win-win situation. The fight is over. Who's going to come up with the best idea? Doesn't mean you're going to get the best people to implement them, but that's another thing. The Arts Council was then developed as an overarching agency to look at the culture and creative sectors. And we now have an action plan from the Arts Council, which I was leading until a couple of months ago, until 2020. We are now entering a new phase of a new cultural policy, which is drafting from 2020 until the next phase. So the first key results were this. We said, okay, 4% of employment is linked to the creative sector, 4% of GDP, 6% of enterprises, with 3% average growth. I looked at the economists around me and said, yeah, what does that mean? And they were like, this means this is an awesome sector. It is actually better than the financial intermediary services. And I said, I was brought up in a country where the finance sector was one of the most important. They said, yeah, welcome to the good news, because now the culture and creative sectors. And then, of course, you get the cultural sector saying, but which part of that is actually music? Which part of that is actually contemporary devised experimental music? And actually, that's not the point, because it's true. Coming from the sector, you'd want to ask that question. But that was not the point at the time. It was about, yes, it's true. 50%, now 70% of that is software design. But in terms of how you build a case, then you have to throw everything inside the basket first to actually win over politicians. Because suddenly it became the sexiest thing ever. Everyone's talking about the creative economy. Everyone thinking that it's kind of like eureka moment, when actually it really isn't. So what did we see there? What were the main observations? The economists were telling us this is a sector that provides higher return on investment, although the gross value added growth is at a slower pace overall, but some subsectors are actually outperforming the rest of the economy. So some subsectors, for example, we had moments where the music sector, the the visual arts were actually outperforming the rest of the economy. Why? Because you had a high value-added sector, mainly created by part-time employment, which was giving so much value added to that sector that was actually outperforming all the rest. But what also emerged was the link between the highly dependent on quality tourism. So when we actually looked at cultural tourism and the link within that, they actually said if you had to compare this, and ideally in the future we'll have a wonderful satellite account for the creative economy, this is the same thing with conversation we had before, that quality becomes one of the most important determinants for the growth of the creative economy. It's not just about the quantity. In fact, it isn't at all. But we also found this, and this is also common in what we saw in other European analysis, that it was also a sector that was resilient to the recession. And as we predicted, there are strong interlinkages between the different subsectors. So let's not silo ourselves. We need to keep on talking with people even outside our own sector. But it was also dependent on investments to address market imperfections and demand to increase sustainability and competitiveness. And that was the most important economic argument on why public investment is important. It's not a bailout. It's not just a little grant or a gift. It's actually because this is a sector that has market imperfections, which why public funding is actually justified. And that is a language which people at the finance ministry understood. It wasn't just, oh, why? Because most of the time we tend to go to the finance ministry with the begging bowl rather than a bowl full of arguments. That actually we're there as peers, and let's debate this with facts and solid arguments. And I've also mentioned quality as a determinant of a high value-added industry. So that's our fat lady, a goddess of fertility, which was a prehistoric figure. And that is found in a museum, in the Archaeology Museum, and was found within one of the complexes where there's the oldest freestanding structures in the world. And we tend to look at cultural heritage as, at times, not even part of the creative economy. This is mainly a sector driven by the public sector. It may not provide high value added in terms of employee. Why? Because it is not there to generate profit. But it is definitely part and parcel of economic development. If we see economic development as this relationship between culture, economy, well-being, and resourcing. So we conducted a study to understand what impact the capital city of Valletta had in terms of museums and festivals. And what emerged was actually purely fascinating. So over the surveyed 2-month period, the direct and indirect impact was almost 15 million euro, with a multiplier of around 2.7. That's equivalent to 0.1% of the GDP. That was generated by a couple of museums, a few festivals in one city on a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean. So actually the argument here developed even further, because these museums and festivals that were not seen as part of economic activity are actually not created for profit, and that's the way they should be in certain circumstances. Actually, the multiplier, what that meant to the economy, was actually stronger than what government was actually investing in those institutions. So suddenly you start looking at what we call, or economists call, positive externalities. So try to shut down all the museums at one point, shut down all the festivals, and see what impact that has on your immediate restaurants, on your immediate streetscapes, on the buildings in your organizations around that museum. Because that is the ecology we're talking about. So it does not mean that a museum that is there not producing financial profit is not providing profit, not only in terms of value to society, because that's the core value, but actually it has a direct impact on the immediate economy. So when we came up with the figure that €1 spent in Heritage Malta, which is the national agency that manages the museums and the historical sites, injects €2 into the economy. People were really happy on Heritage Malta, and they were asking government for more. It's not really about then give us more money. No, it's actually understanding that how much you mean as an organization to the economy. If we just don't look at it in terms of pounds, shillings, and pence. So the 4 pillars we looked at in terms of our strategy, the first moment was looking at governance. The public sector needs to organize itself in a way that is able to champion, to develop, and to nurture the creative economy. Now, there are multiple ways and means on how to do this, via ministry, via arms length organization, via public-private partnerships. The option we went for was a kind of a restructured arts council that at the time was still organizing festivals into a strategic organization that looks at the cultural and creative industries. The second point was looking at from talent to profession. We mentioned this before. Yes, it's great to have loads of talent. But if that doesn't transform itself into something, into a profession, then it's just talent. Now, people have a right to do it as a hobby. Of course, that's the beauty of art. You can do something because you love doing it. But it's also your right to make a living out of it. But it doesn't come in an easy way, and will never be easy, because the nature of how we operate as artists and creative practitioners. So that is where we started looking at new funding programs, incentive programs, and also how our institutions and educational institutions start looking at cultural entrepreneurship within colleges. We then looked at route to market. So it's great, you have a wonderfully trained artist, creative practitioner, what happens with your market? When you have 312 square kilometers as your territory, that's not a huge market. But when you actually think that 500 million people within the European Union is your market, then that's a different conversation. When actually freedom of movement and freedom of goods is part and parcel of, but that means on a competitive level, you'll go absolutely nowhere simply because you're Maltese. Who cares? You just need to have great stuff. And the same thing happens in anywhere around the world. Nationality will not make you a great artist, a great creative practitioner. It's actually what you do and how you go about it. And the fourth point was looking at Malta as a hub for creative exchange. Because, again, you cannot populate the creative ecology just because you have wonderful, great creative artists from Malta. You might need to be in a position where you need to create an ecology that actually welcomes and encourages others to come and share. So Malta has a history of 4,000 years of being transient. People came and come and go all the time. And this is something we wanted to do in terms of our festivals and also our mobility grants to actually allow this conversation to happen between artists and creative practitioners from across the globe. So, coincidentally now Malta has one of the largest digital games institutes, which brings international artists from across the globe. You now have international arts festivals, and actually international artists who are basing themselves in Malta. And also Maltese artists who are basing themselves elsewhere. And that's the kind of ecology you need to have. So 10 years down the line, we now also, and I'm using this as an example because this is a new museum which will be launched at the end of the European Year of Capital Culture, which is this year. It's called Musa, and it's a curated, a community-curated museum within an institution that previously thought of a museum as these perspex boxes and objects that nobody. But this museum is actually thinking in a way that it is the community that curates what's seen in this museum. It's a fine arts museum. But it's also a museum that is looking at branding. It's looking at creating designed objects. It's looking at creating an experience whereby the cafeteria is as important as the most important portrait there is in there. And normally, heritage institutions or publicly driven heritage institutions tend to be quite resistant to the idea of a creative economy. Another project which is being developed and will be launched this year as well is also a new creative cluster, a design cluster, which will be a restored old 16th century, 17th century abattoir, which will be a kind of, it's not a maker space, it's actually a space where designers, even design thinking, will be actually placed within a startup within this cluster. Now, I'm mentioning this because this is 10 years later. So some things take longer than expected. 10 years down the line, do you get a design cluster? 10 years down the line, will you get someone to actually say, hello, I'm a cultural entrepreneur. I've been thinking for 10 years about this. Myself now as an entrepreneur, I've been thinking about this for 10 years, and it took me 10 years to leap into this sector. Oh, there's a bit of a... So 10 years later, what are we seeing? So in the past 15 years, the culture and creative sectors in Malta have seen their direct share grow by around 2.7%, and that they have also now, over the 15-year period, outperformed the rest of the economy in terms of the growth. We also see that the total gross value added is 7%, created by the Maltese economy. That's up from 6% in 2010, which is more than the construction and civil engineering sector and accommodation and the food services. We also see a growth of 9%. So these should impress most of the people out of this room. But what we are really interested in, I'll talk about what does it really mean on the ground to the people who are actually part and parcel. So just a couple of final things. We've seen a drastic increase in creative business services. So actually those sectors that were quite in tune with business development just went ahead, just leapfrogged. Whereas those that were kind of still resistant and to think about it are now in the underdevelopment phase. So we've kind of increased now the discrepancy, the distance between, we do not have a level playing field essentially. And that's something that I will talk about briefly. Employment within the sector has also increased by 18.4%. And I don't know if we can see, that's the most impressive one. Because we've seen public investment shift from 0.4% of national budget to 1.6%, which is one of the highest levels of investments you see across the European Union, which is around €159 per head in Malta. Beyond the facts, what does this mean? Where are we now? We now are in a situation where the National Development Agency, Malta Enterprise, the Enterprise Agency, is now prioritizing the culture and creative sectors as one of the sectors that supports startup. So again, this is not within the Arts Council. So my grant to set up my own business came from Malta Enterprise. And I think this is part of the success and the legacy of this strategy, that now you have at times even more champions outside the sector than within the sector. You now have culture and creative sector research as a permanent base within the National Statistics Office, within the Arts Council, within the Economic Policy Division. Arts Council Malta also looks at supporting, through grants and incentives, people from across the different cultural sectors, which is actually the magic that's created when you have an information session for grants, that you have games designers sitting with theater people, with crafts people, with authors, because that is where new projects actually emerge. And at the same time, what we're also seeing is a shift that people work in film one day, they work in policy the next day, they shift back into crafts, they create work, and that is how the cultural worker operates and lives. We now also see that more young people are actually considering the culture and creative sectors as a profession. We also have the highest percentage of young people employed within the sector. So it's a very young cultural sector. But at the same time, there's the other side, no? The role of the public sector to serve as a catalyst for the growth of the sector is still challenged. You still get public institutions serving themselves rather than serving the sector they have to work for. And it is still highly dependent on government intervention. So now, it's true there are more funds, but that means that the culture of entitlement has increased. That means that people expect government to do something because it's been doing pretty well for quite some time, in the absence of the sector actually organizing itself and getting its act together. And I think this is very, very important to think about the impact that actually quick wins give you on the long term. So just to wrap up, when does the creative economy struggle? It struggles when artists see it as their entitlement. It struggles when they think that once, because there's a strategy, they are now professionals in the field. You will never possibly apply for a job in the arts. You will have to create your own job in the arts. And that is something that I keep on repeating over and over again. I found it very ironic that for 10 years I wrote policies and strategies for the cultural sector, and myself never had the guts to do it. So that's why I quit my job at the Arts Council to be my own boss. And also to understand that no policy or strategy simply shifts your status. I'm now a professional. You actually need to organize yourselves to bring respect to the sector. You just don't earn respect. You build the sector to actually create, to help for the sector to help itself. Quality is replaced by quantity. So again, this is not a quantity game. It's true, figures become important, but the quality remains essential. The creative economy struggles when policymakers fail to make the connection between the social, technological, cultural, and economic development. The links need to remain there and stay there. But the creative economy also struggles when principles such as freedom of expression, equity, openness, and diversity are not understood as conditions that enable the creative ecology to flourish. So this doesn't operate in a vacuum. So yes, censorship does impact negatively. The lack of diversity or respect towards diversity impacts the creative economy. Incidentally, at the same time, this 10-year process, Malta kind of got rid of all possible censorship mechanisms that existed. We also introduced new legislation in terms of LGBTI, so now we're like number one in Europe in terms of legislation. And that is no coincidence that there is a kind of flourishing creative economy, because this becomes part and parcel of the openness required for the creative economy to grow. But the creative economy struggles also when politicians do not understand investment in the creative economy as investment in the talent and well-being of the people they represent. So they're not just bailing out, they're not just giving a little bit because you have to give to culture. You actually need to understand that this is part and parcel, that you are investing and not giving a subsidy, that you are investing and not simply throwing the crumbs to some people. That actually the creative economy struggles when the value is understood only, that creativity is understood only as part and parcel of the arts. It's not just the arts. Let's look at beyond that. Let's look at STEAM. Let's look at science, technology, and education, and how we relate to that. So another thing is the creative economy struggles when we don't own it. You don't own it. And by ownership, I refer to a number of things. First and foremost, copyright. Intellectual property is an automatic right, and no matter what is said, that is what allows the creative economy to grow. It's your automatic right, it is up to you to defend that right and to maximize it. So there's no such thing as copyright operating for different people in different parts of the world. It's a universal right. But ownership of a creative economy strategy means that everyone in this room can do something about it. Fine, some people are empowered more than others. Some people are privileged more than others. But everyone can actually do something. I was absolutely nobody and still am nobody 10 years down the line. But I feel I can contribute, I can add, and when things are going haywire, even back home, I can actually create conversation. And I am still branded as the troublemaker nobody wants to hang around with. So guys, design your future, give it value, celebrate it. Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you for that lovely presentation.
You said that diversity, the lack of diversity, is limiting the potential of creative economy. And in Germany, that is a massive problem. And I feel that all over Europe, it is getting a bigger and bigger problem. And I would like to know how you in Malta succeeded in actually translating that into policy and also making it like a right. How do you implement diversity in the arts policy, is my question.
Thank you.
I was very impressed to hear how your country generate a lot of money.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to the creative industry, such as museum. I'm Cleopas, a museum technician. Most of our museums in our countries, they are having free entrance. How can one contribute to the economy by not charging any entrance fees? Thank you.
just a simple question. As the gentleman said, in their country, they work together with, they actually, how should I say, they integrate art with business strongly, not like here. So what I would ask is, since we here, it's poor, you know, so what opportunities do we stand, or what platforms do you guys have back there that can, or that we can approach?
You alluded to the fact that creative industries thrive or work better using the integrated or sectoral approach. Now, where I'm coming from, we tried to use the sectoral approach, but it did not work. And we still continue operating as independent entities. Heritage, museums, the cultural department, and the arts, they stand out as independent institutions. What advice would you give to bring together or to harmonize the functions of these entities to develop or to come into functional creative industries?
The diversity issue, that's a major crisis for Europe, I would say now, in terms of not diversity as a crisis, but the way we're actually going about it and how radicalization and the fact that people seem to have a right to go against the whole principles of what Europe is also all about. So when we wrote the strategy, it's really interesting because this coincides with the cultural policy. And in the design of the Arts Council, I made sure that we did not take a sectoral approach. So I said, I can't have an executive just for theater, for games, because there are like 30 subsectors there. That would like never-ending employment. And I could guarantee that they wouldn't even be speaking to each other. So we took more on a strategic approach. So I had someone dealing with internationalization, ranging from, looking at the Biennale to in Venice, to actually film internationalization. And one of that roles was actually diversity and communities, which is now embedded in the law. And we also attached, because the approach was strategic, funding programs linked to that. So it wasn't just one kitty, bring in any ideas. It was like, this is people's money, and people's money need to be accounted for based on the strategy. So the way we went about it was, in our strategy at the Arts Council, we said these two funding programs specifically look at community development. And we placed one of the most important funds under the office of the President. So we said we also want the President of the Republic to be championing the cultural sector. So we praised an awards program which actually prioritizes marginalized communities and giving priority to diversity projects. But in a way, that is a very small response, because policy needs to look at migration policy. And they tend to be quite distance from each other. And in fact, one of the things I want to do now in the drafting of the new policy is to draft the cultural policy with colleagues of mine in human rights. Because I do feel now that, and I mentioned this earlier today, that we went 5 steps ahead in the world and creative, and I think we need to go a little bit back and understand what cultural policy should do and why it is important, with, in my head, creative development as part of that conversation. And it's also about, because I think artists are sensitive and are part and very active when it comes to diversity matters. It's just that they only play a very small part in what's happening out there, because the media is stronger than them, populism is stronger than them, and populist parties are stronger than them. So we do have the same tensions that exist in Berlin, in London, in any other city and place in Europe. But I think it also flags up why the arts are even more important and why we play an even more important role. The issue of free entrance in museum, I think you should look at the Nesta study, because there's a lot of work there. So our museums are ticketed, but then there are like free days where museums, you can go in for free on special occasions and museum nights. But you need to keep in mind that you do not generate economic activities simply through sales of tickets. It's what you create around that. And it's also, and you see this now in a lot of like museums in the UK, since that policy was implemented, it actually provides space for the staff and the team to also build another program around it. So it's not about your box office, it's actually the activities that you create around that. So I think this would need to be studied really well, especially when you're choosing between one policy and another. When it comes to then free events, arts events, that's another different conversation. I think, I'm not a fan of, plugging in free events all the time, because ultimately that creates lazy audiences. It also creates a dependency, an unsustainable practice, which is normally subsidized either through other sectors. But we'll leave that conversation outside. Platforms. So I'd like to, rather than say, what kind of platforms exist, I'd like to promote more the idea of what platforms can be created. So one of the things which I was very much concerned with was the fact that the sector, the industry, was not organized in a way where I, from an Arts Council point of view, could have a conversation with the theatre people, with the visual arts sector. And then I'm accused that I only speak to 5 people. Well, I can't really flag up, have meetings all the time with whoever I think is a visual artist. So we created a funding program called the Creative Industries Platform, encouraging the industry to organize itself. And the funding went towards the platform to possibly employ someone to coordinate that platform, to provide training by the platform to the other artists and creative practitioners that work there. So I think this is something that should be developed in any strategy that gives an active place for the sector to be part and parcel of that development. Because as I said, and I'm not a fan of governments doing much, governments need to do less and actually empower the sector to do much more. The sectoral approach. Yes, I can confirm that fragmentation still exists. This strategy did not solve that. And I find it, because ultimately you have little empires. Everyone likes their little empire. But empire building exists in any institution, not just the cultural sector. I think it's also about how, because there are informal structures where these can be created. And it is really up to those institutions to create those connections. But what happened in Malta, for example, was the fact that when we facilitated conversation in the heritage sector, we had theatre people suddenly interested in creating work in museums. We had museum people suddenly interested in working with visual artists, as in from a historical point of view. So actually, most of the time, most projects will not be institution-led. They need to be artist-led. They need to be cultural practitioner-led. And with or without funding most of the time. So I sat through meetings and supported projects, and I was part of projects where I said, to hell with this, I like it. I'll volunteer, But then, of course, you need to counterbalance that with other paid work, because ultimately, you also need to pay your bills. And I think that's it from my end, is it? Yeah? Thank you, guys.
Very much for that presentation.